separated by 3,000 miles. When we think of Hollywood, we don't necessarily associate it with Washington politics. But art, by its very nature, imitates and reflects life. Whether promoting lifestyles, ideology, or war, the media has a powerful hold over public opinion.
Hollywood creates the grand perception of the world. It is the wizard behind the veil.
We know politicians court Hollywood stars for support. Katy Perry was paid over $70,000 to perform for the Hillary Clinton campaign, while it seems no money was needed for Clint Eastwood to stump at the Republican National Convention in 2012. Harvey Weinstein's ties to the Clintons and Barack Obama run deeper than the millions of dollars of campaign contributions he's raised. Obama's daughter Malia went to intern for the Weinstein Company after his presidency. But political campaign support should be expected from citizens, celebrity or not. The deeper threat arises when film and media are influenced to tell stories on behalf of the political establishment. Such products could be construed as propaganda.
There are an awful lot of people in Hollywood who have some kind of relationship with the CIA and Department of Defense. An awful long list of individuals that we put in the book. I mean, loads of these people have visited Langley, and some of them have closer connections than that. So Ben Affleck, for instance, Ben Affleck's former wife, Jennifer Garner, did unpaid recruitment ads for the CIA.
In early 2013, Americans might have found it curious to see the First Lady appear via satellite at the Academy Awards ceremony to announce the Best Picture Oscar for a film about the rescue of American hostages from Iran in 1980 by the CIA.
Well, when I think of other films, big films, that have conveyed the CIA's message, I think of Argo. Argo is a film that talks about the daring do of a couple of CIA agents who go to Iran and rescue 6 American diplomats. The Iranians wanted to let go of those hostages pretty quickly. They didn't really want to cause a problem with the United States of America. But Ayatollah Khomeini, who has been personified as evil in the US press, had made a deal with the Reagan administration, or the Reagan campaign at that point, not to release the hostages. And only after Reagan had been elected, strangely enough, that day the hostages were released. So that film neglects to mention how pivotal the Reagan administration was, or the Reagan campaign was, in making sure that those hostages weren't released. It was called the October Surprise.
The October Surprise may have set the stage for the Iran-Contra scandal of the 1980s, as Reagan's White House cut deals with the Iranian government to sell them arms in exchange for assistance in releasing American hostages, including CIA agents, in Lebanon. The proceeds from those arms sales were illegally diverted to the Contra armies fighting to overthrow the socialist government in Nicaragua.
He'd betrayed America. What he had done was far worse than Nixon and Watergate. And here was Reagan getting away with it. And Katharine Graham, she was one of the leaders of the conservative movement there to kill off. She said no more Watergates, because she said the country can't survive it. So when the Iran-Contra broke, there was no cooperation from the media to go after Reagan on that.
So, for example, in 1994, there was a film called Countermeasures, which had been scripted and greenlit. It was going to star Sigourney Weaver, Gina Davis. It was, a big production. But it was set on an aircraft carrier, and it referred to Iran-Contra, the CIA gun-running scandal involving Iran and Nicaragua and El Salvador and so on. And the military literally said in a memo, "We have no reason to remind the American public of the Iran-Contra scandal or to denigrate the White House." And that is the mentality there. So they said, no, we won't provide an aircraft carrier for your filming, and the film was therefore never made, even though it was a long way down the track. Now that happens time and time and time and time again, which ultimately changes the culture, the popular culture in the United States and across the West. And by changing the popular culture, you're also playing havoc with the political culture as well.
2017, Tom Cruise starred in American Made, a film exposing the dark side of Iran-Contra, that the CIA knew drugs were being smuggled into America to facilitate financing their Contra armies. But the film did its best to portray one of the smugglers, Barry Seal, as an independent wild card, rather than a lifelong CIA asset.
Barry Seal was one of the most important covert operatives of the U.S. from the time of the Bay of Pigs. And yet this movie has the CIA first learning about him when they see that he's successfully smuggling cigars from Cuba. The director, Doug Liman, is the son of the House Majority Counsel to the Kerry Commission that looked into Iran-Contra. They never got to the bottom of the Contra cocaine thing, but his dad was generally looked upon as a good guy. But I do research into him. First of all, he's the guy that made Oliver North famous. It was as a result of his inept questioning that Oliver North became America's hero. And then I find out that this guy, his father, also was a personal attorney for Henry Kissinger, personal attorney for Robert Vesco, personal attorney for Michael Milken, and the list goes on.
Doug Liman's father, Arthur, was not part of the subsequent Kerry subcommittees that ultimately revealed cocaine smuggling in the Contra supply network. When journalist Gary Webb published articles in the San Jose Mercury to better elucidate the relationship between CIA and other agencies that protected Contra drug trafficking, he was run out of mainstream journalism. His story was finally told in 2014's Kill the Messenger.
Gary Webb, was a really great investigative reporter who broke a story right at the beginning of the internet era. It was actually the first big internet news expose. And it involved some allegations of CIA-connected drug sales in the 1980s and LA's biggest crack kingpin, Freeway Ricky Ross, who was well known to the public because the LA Times had already called him the kingpin of crack cocaine, the person most responsible for the rise of the drug epidemic. Gary Webb came along and revealed that Nicaraguans working with the CIA had actually provided him with cheap cocaine for all these years. The three major newspapers all stepped in with the Washington Post, which has traditionally been like the attack dog of the CIA over the decades and to a certain extent still is. They just attacked Gary's story and then attacked Gary's entire career and tried to discredit him and drove him out of journalism. Nothing like that has ever happened before or since, to my knowledge. And again, as you mentioned, it drove him out of journalism and ultimately destroyed his life.
The relationship between the ruling elite and media has existed since the origin of newspapers. But in 1917, Congressman Calloway and Moore sounded the alarm that the J.P. Morgan Bank, working with big steel, shipping, and weapons manufacturers, had purchased controlling interests in 25 of the largest newspapers across the country to promote American entry into the First World War on the side of the British and French, who owed the Morgan banks hundreds of millions of dollars in wartime debts. Hollywood was quickly recruited to the war cause.
In 1917, the government started to issue what they called at the time Liberty Bonds, and Hollywood rallied to the cause and helped sell these Liberty Bonds. You had people like Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, Charlie Chaplin, and other Hollywood stars out there promoting these war bonds.
The whole field of public relations, in fact, the name public relations was created by a guy named Bernays. He created the field, he was a young man, specifically to sell war bonds for the First World War. That was the origin of what we now know as public relations. And he realized instead of telling people, buy bonds because you'll make some money off your bonds, save it will help America. Instead it was like, you're buying bonds to defeat the Hun, that killing babies in Belgium. This was his propaganda, So if you're against killing babies in Belgium, buy U.S. war bonds. And so the whole war bond propaganda, that was the very first use of what we today call public relations.
But you also had during World War I the beginnings of government propaganda on a much larger scale. Much of this was run through the Committee on Public Information that was headed by George Creel. And they were deliberately trying to manipulate the public to support the war. And they did that on a lot of different fronts. Again, during World War I, this was a time when you had vast censorship, where it was against the law to oppose the draft. It was against the law to publicly speak against the war, really. And many very patriotic Americans were thrown into prison during World War I because they were opposing the war, including Eugene Debs, including Big Bill Haywood, people who spoke out against World War I as being a war in which working class kids were being sacrificed in the name of profits for the big banks.
In the 1930s, radio was the internet of its day, and programs like the Radio Research Project at Princeton University, with Rockefeller Foundation financing, had already begun to discern that, in the words of Theodore Adorno, radio music listeners are not childlike, but they are childish. Their primitivism is not that of the undeveloped, but that of the forcibly retarded. Frank Stanton was one of the project's directors before becoming president of CBS News.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News. At 20 minutes before 8 Central Time, Professor Farrell of the Mount Jennings Observatory, Chicago, Illinois, reports observing several explosions of incandescent gas occurring at regular intervals on the planet Mars. The spectroscope indicates the gas to be hydrogen and moving toward the Earth with enormous velocity.
In 1938, Orson Welles created a national panic with his radio broadcast of H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds. About a quarter of the listeners on Halloween morning actually believed they were being invaded by the dread Germans. And 3 years later, that attack did come, not by Germans or Martian invaders, but by the Japanese.
One of the ironies is that many of the people who were going to be blacklisted and graylisted during the McCarthy period were the ones who were out there promoting the war and promoting war bonds during the war.
In the hysteria of the early Cold War, anyone seen as pro-communist, despite the Soviets being America's strongest ally during the war, were now subject to loyalty oaths, background checks, and even unemployment. While some Hollywood actors like Ronald Reagan actually became FBI informants, others refused to disavow their First Amendment freedom of political association during the witch hunt.
In September of 1947, we've got the first hearings about the Hollywood 10, as we've come to know them. They actually called for 41 witnesses, 19 of whom they expected to be hostile. Of those 19, 10 testified, 10 leading Hollywood people, 7 of whom were writers. Only 1 was an actor, but they claimed the First Amendment and refused to answer questions about their political affiliations based upon the First Amendment. They were later found to be in contempt. They were sent to prison in 1950. These are people like Dalton Trumbo, Ring Lardner. Lardner was the most highly paid and successful screenwriter in Hollywood at the time. I mean, these are the top names. These were Academy Award winners, and they were clearly very, very patriotic, and they refused to talk about whether they had been members of the Communist Party. There was nothing illegal about being a member of the Communist Party, and given America's commitment to First Amendment rights, there was no reason why they should be called to testify about that. But careers were ruined.
And my uncle was blacklisted, Oliver Crawford, who later became head of the Screenwriters Guild. And, you know, we do forget that Hollywood was very complicit. And while we talk about there's the story, the unfriendly 10 writers like Dalton Trumbo, who had written anti-war scripts, and now they were being labeled as communists because they weren't going along with the new militarism. But remember, Hollywood did turn in these people. My uncle could not get work. It was very, very difficult to break through. It took him 10 years of being terrorized and being knocked out to be able to get back to Hollywood. And even then, things had to be sanitized. There's a myth that Hollywood was this great liberal outlet. Because when the liberals had it, there was not really any discussion of class war in America, of who's controlling America. In other words, it was soft liberal social issues like gay rights, civil rights, but remember, not too early, only kind of after Martin Luther King smashed them in the face and they couldn't ignore him at the Selma March and Bloody Sunday. But so you have basically social liberalism, women's rights. But again, it's soft stuff, soft liberalism.
While Hollywood tends toward liberality on social issues, its war films rarely question the heroism or benevolent intentions of American troop deployments since World War II.
My father was in that war, and he hated these war movies because of the glorification. He said they're leaving out the real horror show. And because of that, he couldn't stand watching these glorifications of the Second World War.
I really hope you understand how impossible it was to make Platoon. I mean, it was written in 1976. It was not made till 86. I was turned down dozens of times. It was very hurtful. And to be rejected, people would say, it's a great script. It did help my reputation as a writer, but no one would make it because it was too depressing, they said. But I said, what's depressing about the truth? You've got to, truth should be in the movies, but that's a conflict that goes to the heart of Hollywood. I mean, Hollywood was never based on telling the truth. You can't lose money being American. Lone Survivor, he carried Chuck Norris metamorphed into Mark Wahlberg in Lone Survivor, and he kills, how many? I mean, I forgot, 7 Americans get killed. For every American, they take down 20 or 30 Taliban, of course. It's the same thing in Black Hawk Down. Every American who gets killed in that battle, check it out, has to kill I think 30 or 40 dark-skinned people. It's just amazingly, that's the way it has to be. There's kind of a biblical commandment that says 1 dead American equals 30, 40 foreign.
Marcus Luttrell's Lone Survivor certainly glorified the American war machine's ability to fight off overwhelming enemy odds, drawing more upon the mythology of John Wayne's Green Berets than reality. The Green Berets was made during the Vietnam War with the full cooperation of the Pentagon and President Lyndon Johnson. Likewise, Lone Survivor was made during the Afghan War with Pentagon support. It depicted Navy SEALs fending off hundreds of Taliban and killing dozens in a valiant Alamo-like last stand. But the after-action report that day only acknowledged up to 30 Taliban being present and no reports of enemy casualties. Even the Afghani man who saved Luttrell's life denounced the book.
But really what we're talking about is the military having a massive role within Hollywood in terms of manipulating script content. We've found that what was particularly interesting to us was not that there was a large number of these products that were affected, but that previous scholarship, that everyone, all journalists, everybody assumed that there were just a few hundred of these things affected. But we found, using Freedom of Information Act requests, that there are actually a few thousand. And that's obviously been what you might call a cover-up, or at least some kind of sort of soft cover-up, you may put it, to make it look like this isn't such a great issue of censorship, but it is.
Early on in my career, when I sent the Platoon script to get some Pentagon help and the Philippines, they wrote back that we had to really rethink Vietnam. Having been there as a frontline soldier, of course, I objected to all their objections. And not only that, they put out an order, not an order as much as a desist kind of memorandum to their commanders saying that the troops should not cooperate with this movie. Same thing happened to us on Born on the 4th of July.
So I was doing a TV pilot, and we were filming in Northern California, and it was written by Gary DeVore. We played these FBI agents kind of thing. And I get a knock on the door. I've gone through hair and makeup. I've memorized my lines for that day. And I get a knock on the door, and it's the second or third AD. And the guy says, "Well, Stephen, we've got these rewrites for you." You know, I was like, well, wait a second. I've already memorized my lines. Like, why the rewrites, you know? And he said, well, we talked to the FBI, and they want to make these adjustments. And that was my first kind of, introduction to to the fact that if you're playing, if the alphabet agencies or any agencies are used, like FBI, certainly CIA, anytime you're doing a film and those letters are involved, and maybe even in cases where they don't use those letters, but they use something similar, they have final approval on what's being said and what's, what you're saying.
Steve Shellen is a Canadian-born actor who found success in Hollywood films like A River Runs Through It and The Bodyguard. But he alleges that when he tried to launch his own production company in Canada called Lionsgate, his endeavor was sabotaged. To this day, he does not profess to know the who or why behind it.
I had my own bad experience where I was starting a production company and it was stolen from me. My children were threatened and kidnapped. I ended up basically losing everything, including a nice house under the Hollywood sign, a farm up here in Canada. And I was on the run, being tracked and followed, and I was pretty undone by the whole experience. Well, I went in a bar in Beverly Hills one night, and I ran into Gary DeVore, and Gary was friendly as usual. Hey, Steve, how you doing? And I was like, oh, Gary, you wouldn't believe this. And I gave him like the mini version of what I'd gone through. And what was kind of great is that Gary didn't look at me like I was nuts. He didn't discount what I was saying. He just basically agreed with me and said, yeah, well, they can do that if they want. He also told me about a project he was working on that had to do with the war in Panama. And he was divulging stuff or writing about stuff, and that, his buddies in the CIA were not happy.
This is 20 years ago, and we know a lot of this now. We did not then. And what this was about was the Medellin cartel sending huge amounts of cocaine into the United States, and the government being aware of it and not taking the stand against it that they might have, and that there was a tremendous amount of money from the Medellin cartel transferring this cocaine into our country that went under the guise of a business deal, I guess, and was put into Panamanian banks while Noriega was in power there with us. And the money was laundered and was spent on insurgency groups, Nicaragua, Sandinistas, all of the things that we now actually know are pretty true. But then there was none of this known, and for reasons that I was unaware of at the time, Gary was aware of all of these things.
Gary DeVore was a successful screenwriter, known for his films like The Dogs of War and Raw Deal, as well as his bizarre disappearance.
It was 1997. He was on his way back to turn a script into the studio that he was going to direct, and it was actually the only time that the finished script, the computer, all of the research was in one place. It was in his car, and he disappeared on his way back. Members of the CIA and the NSA appeared in my home within the first 4 or 5 days, and many other unusual things started happening. I realized that perhaps it was not a typical crime. It only aims in one direction. It aims in the direction that this person was definitely working with the intelligence community. They said, don't you believe he's dead? It's been over a year. And I said, no. If you want me to believe he's dead, give me a body. 9 days later, I was given a body. I was awakened at 7 in the morning. It was Chase Brandon calling me from Langley saying they found the car. They found the car with the body in it. And there was a 3-hour time difference, of course, between New York and LA. And at 10 o'clock, they called me from the sheriff's department in LA to tell me they'd found the car.
Well, they found him a year later or whatever in his truck. The skeletal remains, and then his hands were supposedly thrown in the back of the truck. So I guess that was sending a message to anybody that if you go rogue, or if you go, off the ranch, as they say, or whatever, and you're hitting up against the CIA and what their plans are, then this is what we're going to do. And I guess cutting off the hands is really indicative of, that's his tool, right? His hands.
The mystery of Gary DeVore's fate may linger as long as that of JFK, but it is intriguing that DeVore's disappearance came in 1997, the year after the CIA established its first official Hollywood liaison office. It may have been merely symbolic, but it seemed to portend the coming decade of the 2000s, when the Patriot Act and a US-led global war would dominate the American conscience, as though the US government did not trust its citizens to think critically for themselves. And more importantly, crises would have to unfold cathartically on the big screen, where the heroes of the American intelligence services and military would inevitably fight to defend global freedom. But behind the lies, we must ask ourselves, how much have we swallowed the pill of propaganda, evolved from psychological warfare, a phrase derived from Nazi Germany's Weltanschauungskrieg, worldview warfare. In 1991, Warner Brothers released an Oliver Stone film that challenged the entire government narrative of the Kennedy assassination. JFK was not only a blockbuster success, nominated for Best Picture, it prompted congressional legislation promising to release all government files on the case by 2017. The film presented a conspiracy theory of CIA and Pentagon elements colluding to foment a coup d'etat against the presidency on behalf of the military-industrial complex.
What happened was that after JFK, they opened an office in Hollywood. The Pentagon always had this Hollywood relationship going back for years, but CIA never quite this way. So they opened an office in '96. They sent out a guy called Chase Brandon. He mentored and he got involved with Sum of All Fears, Argo, Zero Dark 30, the Alias series, MI3. Charlie Wilson's War is more of a Pentagon deal, but then it was complete distortion. Tom Hanks is a hero. Charlie Wilson was an idiot, a moron who went to Afghanistan and caused a lot of damage. Bill Casey was running his own war in Afghanistan. It's a very complicated story, but the analysis of Charlie Wilson's war is that, we have to go to war for Afghanistan because the Soviets are going to destroy Afghanistan and threaten our way of life.
Zero Dark 30 is also an egregious example of propaganda. One of the premises of Zero Dark 30 is that torture is not only efficacious, but beneficial in the war against quote-unquote terror.
I'm not your friend. I'm not going to help you. I'm going to break you. Any questions?
Waterboarding has been a U.S. instrument of interrogation dating back to its wars in Vietnam and even the Philippines. The CIA even created its Kubark intelligence manual in 1963 to teach torture methods. Thus, it should come as little surprise to see the CIA torturing captured suspects in a film written with CIA approval about the hunt for bin Laden.
There was a book that was recently published by John Rizzo, who was a counsel for the CIA. It was called Company Man. And although he lauded the CIA and all the good works that the CIA did, he did mention somewhat innocuously that there were Hollywood assets sprinkled throughout Los Angeles.
Carl Bernstein had a seminal article in the Rolling Stone magazine in 1977, the Watergate muckraker, that when he covered the U.S. Senate Church Committee and their findings on U.S. intelligence and the CIA, he found that well over 400 members of the media lived dual lives in their work for the CIA. And these were not just regular journalists, but the owners of all the major media. He listed them, the owners of CBS, ABC, NBC, et cetera, Time Incorporated. Different ways they did it was basically owning, getting ownership over most of the media.
I've been a journalist for about 25 years, and I was educated to lie, to betray, and not to tell the truth to the public. Now, you ask, what have I done for intelligence agencies? So please see, most of the journalists you see in foreign countries, they claim to be journalists, and they might be journalists, but Many of them, like me in the past, are so-called non-official cover. It means you too work for an intelligence agency. You help them if they want you to help them, but when they find out that you're not only a journalist but a spy too, they will never say, oh, this was one of our guys. They will not know you. That means non-official cover. So I have helped them in several situations, and I feel ashamed for that too now. Like I feel ashamed that I have worked for a very recommended newspaper like the Frankfurter Allgemeine, because I was bribed by billionaires, I was bribed by the Americans not to report exactly the truth. I just tried to work out in my brain what would have happened if I would have written a pro-Russian article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine. Well, I don't know what would have happened, but we were all educated to write pro-European, pro-American, but please, not pro-Russian.
Frank Wisner was the head of Operation Mockingbird, and one of his famous quotes is, "You could buy a journalist cheaper than you could buy a good call girl."
While Frank Wisner ran Project Mockingbird for the CIA, he was strongly supported by Katharine Graham's husband, Philip, then the head of the Washington Post. The CIA also colluded with ABC, NBC, Reuters, the New York Times, William Paley of CBS, a former psychological warfare specialist during World War II, and Time Life, whose managing director, C.D. Jackson, had also been a psychological warfare specialist.
Buying up Hollywood is a bipartisan effort. And early on, I mean, one of the things that funded the Clinton Foundation, for example, Frank Giusti, who seized control of Lionsgate, his goal is not movies and propaganda. His goal was ownership of a president and possibly a future one, Clinton and the Mrs. Clinton. And so, for example, I was in Kazakhstan, and Clinton had shown up there with Giusti of Lionsgate, and now Clinton says there's no connection. His wife had gotten the dictator of Kazakhstan removed from a federal indictment for bribery as Secretary of State. Then Bill Clinton shows up with Giusti, says kind words about this bloodthirsty dictator, Nazarbayev, and then Giusti, who's literally Clinton's ride into Kazakhstan, has a private meeting with Nazarbayev and comes out with the exclusive contract to mine Kazakhstan's uranium. Now, maybe there's no connection, but Giusti then is in such a good mood that he gives over $30 million to the Clinton Foundation.
While the Clintons may have embedded themselves with Frank Giustra of Lionsgate, President Trump's Secretary of Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, co-founded Rat Pack in 2004, with director Brett Ratner financing dozens of blockbuster films like the X-Men series and Avatar.
For example, one of his first films that he funded when he walked in was American Sniper, which was, basically glorifying, the kind of killer SEAL Team 6 hit squads, military glorification. It's a long way from platoon to sniper. So that was the Mnuchin shift, and now he's our Secretary of Treasury.
American Sniper is really an egregious case of propaganda. It's set in the second siege of Fallujah, which was a bloodbath. I mean, the Americans, we cut off the electricity, the water to the Iraqis, and scores of innocent civilians were killed.
Increasingly so as the American media becomes a corporate mouthpiece for the government's point of view. There's a natural conflict, and that's what I'm interested in. I guess conflict. If I agreed with the government point of view, why would I make movies like that? We have directors who are quite willing to do that because they can get the cooperation, certainly big money from the Pentagon, like Ridley Scott admits to that. And Black Hawk Down's fun to watch. It's a great, technically a brilliant film. He's a brilliant filmmaker. But it's a horrible film in the same sense that Lone Survivor is. It's just every American who goes down is a perfect hero. I've never seen people, I mean, I've been in combat. I've seen people get scared, They know they're going down in the helicopter and they're still talking to the commander and in official technology terms and saying, mission complete or this or that or something noble or sentimental, but it doesn't work that way. People are scared. Most people, before they die in some kind of way, the last thought in their head is, oh, shit.
Black Hawk Down was originally quite a kind of neutral and very successful book by Mark Bowden, and I get the impression that he very much was okay with the military heavily rewriting that and the producers heavily reworking his material. There was actually some quite critical material in that original book, Black Hawk Down, but it was all excised. And the original script, of course, had more, even the script after it had been watered down by directors and producers, had more salacious and violent material in it, which would have called into question the Americans' role in Somalia in 1993.
Where our troops are now all over Africa. We're starting in Africa now. We have bases in how many countries in the world? 130. We have some kind of military mission. We have 900, or we don't know how many bases. We think we have 700 to 900 bases abroad, as well as 6,000 in the U.S. It's quite a military machine we have. We have two countries. We have the Pentagon and we have the U.S. Which country am I in?
I remember that one great British newsman had said when seeing film from Vietnam, which was at that time uncensored, people could go, all over Vietnam, shooting film, and you could see, like a child running down the street on fire from napalm. These are the images that Americans were beginning to see about Vietnam. And Alistair Cooke said, that's the end of war, because once people with television and cameras now in the field, no one's ever going to support a war when they see the horror show that it creates, the misery and the horror and the terror and the murder of civilians and children that are just an automatic adjunct of war. War is over.
After the First World War, the British established the Tavistock Clinic to study shell shock and other psychological conditions experienced by returning veterans, leading to much work and theory in the field of social and group control.
The Tavistock Institute, for example, which dealt with a lot of social engineering projects and post-World War I and World War II PSYOP, they actually studied Hitchcock films to figure out how people could be shocked in a certain way or traumatized. So in a way, trauma research and its connection to movies like Psycho, which was revolutionary for its time, that was actually studied in a scientific way. And so in that sense, mass traumatization through degradation in film or something like that we see with a lot of these really disgusting modern horror films, this kind of stuff, that was actually studied in such a fashion that it could be used to socially engineer. There's a propaganda level. There's also the traumatization level, which I think happens at a lower, deeper subconscious level through the degradation that we see in a lot of these movies, the really dark stuff at times. And what that does is basically puts people into a catatonic state, and that's done on purpose, as I said, with the studies that were done into Hitchcock films, because when you're in a kind of jilted catatonic state, you're actually much more suggestible.
At the end of the Second World War, a number of psychological warfare specialists shifted into a new field of study called communication research, with the government subsidizing much of the work being done at universities like Princeton, Columbia, and MIT. Meanwhile, the CIA sponsored the Congress for Cultural Freedom, with artists like Leonard Bernstein, George Orwell, and Jackson Pollock as symbols of Western culture and liberal expression, while artists like Paul Robeson, the black singer and actor who advocated for civil rights and peace with the Soviets, were hounded.
At that time, they were targeting great activist entertainers such as Paul Robeson, who was an amazing musician, considered one of the best singers in the world, and also an actor. And so you find that they seriously targeted Paul Robeson, dosing him with acid, for example, according to his son, Paul Robeson Jr., in a hotel in Moscow about a few weeks before he was going to meet with Che Guevara and Fidel Castro. The CIA had started a group called the Congress of Cultural Freedom, and that group was huge, gave out vast amounts of money that, in effect, in studying all the CIA documents and U.S. intelligence documents, they became America's secret Ministry of Culture.
In Hollywood, the CIA had assets like Luigi Laraschi working at major studios like Paramount, as well as MGM and RKO, to, in the words of psychological warfare expert C.D. Jackson, insert in their scripts and in their actions the right ideas with the proper subtlety.
There was an Air Force studio in Los Angeles called Lookout Mountain Movie Studios, Film Studios, owned by the Air Force. And they got all the major producers and actors of the time, of the 40s and 50s. We're talking about Walt Disney and John Ford and Marilyn Monroe and a number of major actors to sign confidentiality agreements that were akin to having top secret clearance in the military about the films that they made in Lookout Mountain Studio. And they made over 19,000 films in that studio.
This was a private Air Force studio that only the Air Force had access to, and they filmed some 20,000 different films, most of which we've not actually seen. There are actually archived footage, though, that I've found and put in different videos that I've made that show what they were doing. And what they were doing was actually selling a lot of propaganda through using big Hollywood stars at that time. For example, Jimmy Stewart's actually in some of the Laurel Canyon film footage.
The Air Force's Lookout Mountain Studio, atop Laurel Canyon, was officially shut down in 1968.
There are some connections, for example, that Dave McGowan has made in his book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, where he points out that a lot of the Hollywood scene, a lot of the music scene, especially the precursor to the hippie revolution, which he titles the Laurel Canyon scene, most of those families, Jim Morrison's dad was actually an admiral. He was involved in the Gulf of Tonkin false flag incident. Frank Zappa's family actually worked at a biowarfare lab.
Frank Zappa grew up at the Edgewood Arsenal, where his father was one of many human guinea pigs for chemical weapons research. But the military wasn't the only government group experimenting on humans, as the CIA's post-war MKUltra program worked to control the human mind with experimental techniques and drugs like LSD.
When you look at the guys who studied MKUltra and who founded it and got it going, people like Gordon Wasson, they actually went and they studied indigenous groups, indigenous cultures in South America, Latin America, to find out how the shamans ran their tribes. So you could look at the CIA MKUltra guys as kind of like shamans. That was their goal. That was their purpose in promoting LSD and promoting this kind of stuff through the counterculture, through the stuff that, we talked about with the Doors and Mamas and the Papas and the Beatles, the drug revolution and all that. That was largely a CIA promoted social engineering tool. So that's the real kicker here, is that it's about manipulating culture. It's not so much about creating an individual assassin. I mean, that kind of stuff does happen, the Jason Bourne type stuff. But really, the big plan is to use culture to socially engineer.
I found that with musicians, there was a common theme, and what the common theme was is they got a lot of agents involved in these people's lives and influenced them to start using drugs, promoting drugs inadvertently without them realizing, that why they were doing it. But then when they started sobering up, they were done away with. There was, tons of ways that they were trained in COINTELPRO tactics, and COINTELPRO is the FBI's counterintelligence program that had murderously targeted the Black Panthers and other black activists, as well as white activists. A U.S. Congressional Committee had said that in 1993 that we have to start focusing on political rappers, and it's a concern, a serious concern, that political rappers are influencing black youth to become more political. When I investigated the case of the rap artist Tupac Shakur, the FBI, I filed a Freedom of Information Act, and the FBI basically admitted to me, they said that there's over 4,000 pages in Tupac's FBI file, and I had to pay for all those pages, and then they only sent me 99 pages that were themselves redacted.
While Tupac may have appeared to be a threat because of his mainstream influence and Black Panther heritage, the targeting of political parties and opposition voices domestically has occurred illegally for years as part of the FBI's COINTEL program. And more recently, the National Security Agency has worked with the British government's communication headquarters to, quote, inject all sorts of false material onto the internet in order to destroy the reputation of its targets, and to use social sciences and other techniques to manipulate online discourse and activism to generate outcomes it considers desirable. One filmmaker who challenged the government's social engineering to control and alter human behavior was Stanley Kubrick.
What he did, I think, in the long run was throughout his movies, he showed a consistent pattern of showing MK Ultra as something very real. You see this in Clockwork Orange, where the Alex character is strapped down and he's given a bunch of drugs. This is actually detailed in the MK Ultra Dr. Ewan Cameron's work. It's detailed in the book by Dr. John C. Lilly, who's actually one of the MK Ultra doctors, how he would strap people down and give them LSD and wipe their brains, reprogram them. So what you're seeing in Kubrick films is, generally speaking, real. There is a propaganda aspect, as we said, with 2001. But when we look at Clockwork Orange, when we look at Eyes Wide Shut, these are films that I think are showing real aspects of conspiracy and how it relates to Hollywood and the government.
The Tavistock Institute's Eric Trist and Fred Emery predicted in their book A Choice of Futures, a Clockwork Orange reality where youths commit random acts of violence, then go home and watch it on TV, as mass media and television put them into increasingly dissociated states. Perhaps we have entered that dissociated state, with wars and rumors of wars echoing daily, while superheroes save the world nightly on our mobile screens.
We have been attacked. We are at war.
In 2017, luminary director Rob Reiner created the Committee to Investigate Russia with former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper, who lied to Congress about NSA domestic surveillance, and David Frum, renowned for coining the axis of evil phrase as President George W. Bush's speechwriter. Reiner chose Morgan Freeman, known for playing the voice of God, to deliver the message.
I mean, you have guys like Rob Reiner, who is associated with the ultimate of the cabal of liberal Jewish thinkers in Hollywood, and suddenly they're talking about Russia, Russia, Russia. Russia's now seized control of the new media.
Now the fashion is, you got to hate the Russians. The Russians subverted the election, trying to destroy American values and so forth. But we heard this before in the 1950s.
From this day forward, you will become sparrows. Weapons in a global struggle for power.
You belong to them. They'll never let you go.
The most simple aspect of propaganda is just to try to kind of sell and build the brand. For example, it was recently obtained through FOIA request the influence of the Pentagon and the FBI in different shows, and this included things like Cupcake Wars. The Pentagon was involved in directly funding pro-military aspects and phrases, propositions to be added to the script for something innocuous like Cupcake Wars. And that's because, again, they're interested in culture creation and managing and steering the culture. So that's why they have to control the musicians. That's why they have to control the A-list stars, and so forth and so on. So yes, absolutely, we can see a direct parallel between movies like Zero Dark 30, which, again, totally promotes the CIA mythology of bin Laden. We can look at American Sniper, which you mentioned, which is promoting this mythology of Chris Kyle to basically be recruitment films. That's what these are in their most simple aspect. And we know, in fact, that the CIA consults on shows like Homeland. That's public knowledge, public news.
Since the birth of Freudian psychology, the major techniques used by media to sell its product have been insecurity and sex.
By the standards of America, Hollywood is liberal. We live extravagantly. Obviously, our sex lives, as we can be seen from the recent news, are above normal, extraordinary, you would say. We spend liberally on things that seem crazy to people, to spend $1 million doing scenes in a movie, Plus, it's got an aura of fun and sin.
But one of the darker sides of Freudian psychology's elaboration on childhood sexuality is not only the increasing sexualization of teens and preteens by media, but the overt pedophilia that has been exposed in recent years from Washington to Hollywood. With former Speaker of the House Dennis Hastert being sentenced, and Hollywood celebrities like Kevin Spacey and director Bryan Singer accused.
Has anyone asked Bryan Singer, do you have settlements with anybody? Ask Marty Singer, Bryan Singer's attorney. Did Bryan Singer settle with anyone? No one's asked and no one wants to ask. That's the thing. Nobody in Hollywood wants to ask the tough questions because it's going to cost them a lot of money. We're talking about the X-Men franchise.
Today we have things starting to break with the Bryan Singer allegations and the Corey Feldman allegations. And I think that Hollywood would definitely be ripe for blackmail.
Convicted pedophile Jeffrey Epstein, the billionaire friend to stars like Kevin Spacey and Chris Tucker, as well as statesmen like Bill Clinton and Prince Andrew, may indicate deeper layers to Hollywood and Washington's pedophilia that have yet to be explored.
The thing about Epstein that really hasn't come out, it's come out a little bit that he's pandered these children to the rich and the powerful, but there's been a lot of innuendo of blackmail that Epstein deployed. And actually, when the Palm Beach Police Department searched his home, there were hidden cameras in Epstein's home. Kevin Spacey and Harvey Weinstein's names are in Epstein's Black Book.
I'm not talking some weird conspiracy. I'm just talking that these people all work in circles together, and they're highly organized, and people need to wake up and realize that. This isn't just a few random instances of some lone pedophile. These guys all run in the same circles, and they need to be exposed, and some of them are very powerful and very wealthy.
While Hollywood has the power to tell stories that reflect our dreams and realities, there is both a dark and light potential to such magic. The government and ruling elite desiring to influence and shape those stories should come as no surprise. But we, the captive audience, must recognize that there are deeper agendas at work. For as Raquel Lindsay predicted over 100 years ago, the art of the moving picture can replace religion with its mystical images and rousing music, wherein prophets may conjure a higher form of vision seeing.